Okay, welcome back. This is the second of our recordings dealing with the colonial period. And technically anything prior to the sort of achievement of American independence is the colonial period, but I've broken different parts down into different sort of topics or themes, and this is the one that I'm calling specifically the colonial period. But the next several sections that we do will definitely be part of the colonial period in a historical sense. When we talked about Jamestown, we introduced some of the realities of the Jamestown experience, the difficulties in the first years of its settlement, the relations with Native Americans, especially talked a lot about the introduction of tobacco, indentured servitude, slavery, that kind of thing. One of the really fascinating things about history is the way that it can show us patterns, show us cause and effect relationships that speak all the way down to explaining the way the world is today, right? And there are some cases where we can see those kinds of ripple effects or cause and effect relationships more clearly than we can in other cases, but they're always there. And one of the things that we will see throughout this class is the long-term consequences of differences between northern and southern states. And those differences will, of course, ultimately result in a civil war. At the root of the Civil War, no matter what anybody says, is slavery. There is not anything that you can say, well, yeah, but slavery was the root cause of the Civil War. It manifests itself in different ways, and there are tangents that split off of that in one direction or another. But the Civil War is because of one part of the country wanting to ensure the survival of slavery as an institution and the expansion of that institution into new territories. That's what it is. Those foundations are laid totally unintentionally all the way back in the 1600s. And some of those foundations have to do with the establishment of Jamestown. The other half has to do with the way that northern colonies are founded. And the first northern colony is Plymouth. Plymouth is the result of the Pilgrim settlers arriving in the fall of 1620. For whatever reason, better publicists, better marketing campaign, I don't know. Americans remember the Pilgrims. They remember Plymouth, right? Thanksgiving, people with buckles on their hats and buckles on their shoes and, all of those kinds of things. They remember the Pilgrims way better than they remember the establishment of Jamestown, even though Jamestown happens more than a decade earlier. But Plymouth and the Pilgrims have become part of the popular imagination in a way that the Virginia Company of London has not. So the Pilgrims, who were they? Well, they are, of course, traveling to America for quote-unquote religious freedom, which isn't entirely true. They're traveling to America because they are being persecuted for their particular version of Christianity. We don't have time to go through the entire Reformation, and we don't have time to go through religion in English history. Essentially, the Pilgrims believe that Christianity in England, mainstream Christianity in England, is too Catholic. And this is a problem for them. They decide that the best solution is to leave England and try to establish a settlement somewhere else where they can practice their religion the way they see fit. They are in no way interested in religious freedom or religious tolerance. They are extremely restrictive and extremely discriminatory when it comes to non-Puritan Christians. So let's not get the wrong idea that says, oh, well, the Pilgrims wanted religious tolerance and they believed in people being able to practice their faith. No, far from it. They believed in being able to practice their own faith without interference from other people. But they certainly were not interested in giving that same freedom to other people of other faiths. So initially, the Pilgrims think, well, maybe we'll try Holland. We'll land in Holland and see how that goes. It doesn't work. So they decide, maybe the Americas. There is a rival joint stock company, investment company, called the Virginia Company of Plymouth, right? We talked about the Virginia Company of London. That's the one that sponsors the settlement of Jamestown. A different company, the Virginia Company of Plymouth, wants to try to establish its own colony. They intend for it to arrive or to be established in and around the Chesapeake. But ultimately, because of a lot of different factors, the initial attempt fails. Fails in the sense that the Pilgrims who sail on the Mayflower never make it down to the Hudson River or to the Chesapeake Bay. Partially, this is because the original expedition was intended to fill 2 ships, the Mayflower and another ship called the Speedwell. The Speedwell sinks pretty much immediately, meaning that all of the people from that vessel end up on the Mayflower. So there's not enough food, there's not enough beer, there's not enough space to hold all of the people who are ultimately on the Mayflower. And so by the time the Pilgrims arrive along the New England coast, they are most worryingly running out of beer. And beer is an essential component of, well, let's be honest, daily life. But for people traveling the Atlantic, beer is essential because it doesn't go stagnant. It doesn't go foul in the way that water will. So it's really the only liquid that you have. Beer and cider are the things that people will be able to drink on board ship. So if you're running out of beer, this isn't just like you're on a cruise and they're out of alcohol. This is like you will potentially die because there is no fresh water that you can carry on a ship because it's going to go bad. So they're forced to look along the coast of New England for some place to settle. This is not their original intent. This is not their original idea, because their original idea was, we're going to make it all the way down the coast, closer to Virginia. We'll be able to land where there is already an existing government, there's already existing settlements that we can just kind of plug ourselves into. So since they don't have that, they're forced to come up with their own system of government. And what they decide on is what's called the Mayflower Compact. And they write down the Mayflower Compact before they even establish a permanent settlement in New England. And this, in theory, is a completely democratic system, one in which everybody is equal, everybody will have a say in the operation of the community. In reality, though, it's a little bit lopsided. Not everyone on the Mayflower was Pilgrims. Here again, we tend to think, well, the Mayflower was the Pilgrims, they landed, blah, blah, blah. There were lots of people on the Mayflower who were just other people that were not concerned with religious issues whatsoever. They were involved in this as either indentured servants, or they were involved in hoping to establish their own farms or their own blacksmith shops or their own carpenter carpentry businesses in the New World that were not pilgrims at all. The Mayflower Compact, in the end, says everybody's equal, except people who are leaders in the Puritan Church. They will have a little bit more influence and authority than other people. So it is a little bit lopsided in that way. While they are still on the Mayflower, they send out various expeditions around the coast, trying to find some place that they can establish a settlement. From time to time, they will get into skirmishes with local Indians. From time to time, they will rob Indian burial sites, because some Native Americans in New England are kind of Egyptian in their burial practices, right? They will bury people with food and with clothing and these kinds of things as part of the rituals, as part of the burial rites. And so pilgrims will desecrate these graves, take the food, take the clothing for their own benefit. Eventually, on one of these expeditions, these excursions, they find a village, a deserted Native American village, near what they will then call Plymouth. It was deserted almost certainly because of an epidemic that had struck the local population. From the Pilgrims' perspective, though, they see everything as evidence of God's hand at work, and they say, well, clearly God eliminated these savages, these Indians, from this community, specifically because he knew we were coming and he knew that we needed someplace to stay. I'll leave it to you to decide if that was the reality or not, but that's the way the Pilgrims perceive it. And so this is going to be the genesis of the Plymouth colony. Plymouth is similar to Virginia in some respects, but different in other significant respects. It's similar from the standpoint that farming is very, very difficult in New England, much as it is difficult in Virginia. It's difficult for different reasons, though. New England has a much rockier soil, much colder climate. So it's not because of the heat and the high water table and that kind of thing that we have in Virginia, but it's kind of for the opposite reasons. But the end result is that farming is difficult. Ultimately, and possibly as you have heard, the Pilgrims get some support. They get some sort of guidance from Native Americans that say, here's how we farm, here's some of the kind of cheats and workarounds that we use to establish farming that we can keep alive with. Plymouth settlers are very different from Jamestown settlers. Jamestown initially is all men. It takes several years before any women arrive as part of the Jamestown colony. Plymouth, though, is entire families that travel together. And so it's much more tightly knit. It was always intended to be permanent. You have, even though not all of the people on the Mayflower were Puritans or Pilgrims, there is definitely a very significant church presence to the settlement of Plymouth. So it creates that kind of social foundation and a certain amount of even political framework that Plymouth uses to build itself around. So you have towns, you have villages, you don't have plantations, you don't have people spread out over long distances. You have smaller kinds of commercial enterprises or occupations where you don't have the need for a large labor force because families are going to be working their own small farms, families are going to be operating their own smithies or their own businesses. Yes, you'll have indentured servants. Yes, you'll have slaves. Every colony in North America has slaves at the time of the Revolution. So it's not where the North is free and the South is slave. That's not the case. But the numbers are vastly different, right? Northerners have far fewer enslaved people than Southerners. And it is a very different kind of society, and partially because of that, it's a very different kind of political structure. New England develops a democracy where you have town hall meetings, people live close together, people don't have the dramatic differences in wealth or in social standing that we have in southern colonies. And so they can have the opportunity to gather together on a fairly regular basis in a central location in town and discuss and converse about the issues that face the town, whether it's economic, whether it's Indian relations, you name it. And so overall, Plymouth is going to be way less incendiary, way less volatile than parts of the Chesapeake. That's, again, it's not to say that they don't have conflict with their surrounding Native American neighbors, because they do, in some cases, extremely violent conflict. It's not to say that they don't have internal kinds of disruptions, because they do. In some cases, very troublesome kinds of internal disruptions. But broadly speaking, you don't see things like Bacon's Rebellion breaking out in New England. Ultimately, Plymouth gets absorbed into a larger Puritan colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That happens in 1691, which means that long-term, Plymouth will not be a standalone colony of its own. It's actually going to be part of the larger Massachusetts Bay Colony. Massachusetts Bay then is centered on Boston. It's established as a result of a large migration that happens in 1630, where you're talking about thousands and thousands of people that move from England to New England, basically all at once. So Plymouth is a very different experience than Jamestown. The differences in Plymouth's evolution, the differences in the establishment of Plymouth, the differences in the function of Plymouth, the differences in the settlement, the economy, the population, the society, the politics, will all be at the core of sectional differences that will in many ways distinguish northern states and colonies from southern states and colonies. Over time, England establishes other colonies throughout the eastern seaboard, east of the Appalachian Mountains. They're all created for different purposes. Virginia created as a mercantilist venture, right? Purely commercial. New England, many of the New England colonies are created out of religious divisions or concerns. There are colonies that are created initially exclusively as royal grants, right? The king will just give land to followers or supporters. It's a very diverse kind of colonial system. And for the most part, as we will talk about again here and there over the next few sections, the colonies are largely independent. They are all part of the British Empire, but they exist as separate parts of the British Empire. So Massachusetts Bay is its own entity. New York is its own entity. South Carolina is its own entity. Georgia, right, the last of the colonies to be established, they are all created for different reasons, and they all operate largely as sovereign things. This is going to play a role in partially the lead up to and the experience of the American Revolution, and it's even going to be bubbling under the surface of American history all the way up to the Civil War. So that's that section. The next and final section will talk a little bit more broadly about the way the British government oversees and operates the colonies, how the colonies fit into the British system of politics, the British system of economics, that kind of thing. Basically trying to lay a foundation for what life is like and how the colonies fit into the empire on the eve of the revolution in the 1760s and 70s. So make sure that you're reviewing the long PowerPoints on Blackboard. Let me know if you have any questions. And I will see you back here for the third of our recordings about the colonial period in America.